The last thing Kurt did before he died was push his wife out of the way. In a statement read to the inquest, Melissa said that she was forever grateful for the time they had together, allowing me to be the mother of his children, and especially for Kurt's heroic actions on that day, saving my life.
Back here now, and we saw a little earlier in the programme the aggro the Prime Minister is getting from Boris Johnson over Brexit, so she might have allowed herself at least the ghost of a smile over one impact of the parliamentary boundary changes finally set out today. They will see seats in the House of Commons cut by 50 to 600 as the total number of voters in each is evened up. Labour would be hit the hardest if the changes had been in place in last year's election. Our political analysts think the Conservatives would have won a majority of around 16. But there are Tories who are impacted too. And yes, you guessed it, Boris Johnson is amongst them. The same assessment concluded his majority would have been cut, while the constituencies of other Brexiteer MPs like Priti Patel and Bill Cash would disappear altogether, as would that of the former Brexit Secretary David Davis, all of which will break Theresa May's heart.
In one region, Yorkshire and the Humber, the number of constituencies would be cut from 54 to 50, and nearly all facing changes, like Keighley, won last time by Labour's John Grogan, but likely to have turned blue if the new boundaries had been used, while Great Grimsby, won by Labour's Melanie Onn, would be split between two neighbouring Conservative constituencies. In all, it's likely Labour would lose 3 seats.
Been in decline for some time. If you go back 3 years, Mary, you'll see that shares were changing hands for about 90 pence a pop. They took a tumble just after the EU referendum and have continued a sort of steady decline. Christmas last year was miserable. This year we've seen a stream of profit warnings in January, April, June, the latest today. Now, the good news, Mary, is that the company still
Hello again, welcome back. The United Nations has warned the all-out military assault on Idlib in Syria could provoke the worst humanitarian catastrophe of the 21st century. Russian and Syrian government jets launched airstrikes on the province last week in a bid to take the country's final rebel-held area. In that time, more than 30,000 civilians have been forced to flee. It's feared 800,000 could eventually be made refugees. And a warning, there are some upsetting images in this report from John Ray, who's on the Turkish-Syrian border.
Now, with the final ground assault of Syria's 7-year civil war imminent, its consequences were made alarmingly clear by the United Nations today. The attack by President Assad's forces on the rebel-held city of Idlib could become this century's worst loss of life, one senior UN official said. 3 million people live inside the Idlib de-escalation zone, supposedly a safe place for civilians, with 2 million in need of aid. Nearly half the population have been forced from their homes in other parts of Syria, and now more than 30,000 people have taken flight since the ground bombardment started last week. It's feared a new offensive could send as many as 800,000 refugees fleeing towards the border. These figures are enormous, of course, and the country is already home to 3.5 million Syrian refugees, with hundreds of thousands living in camps on both sides of the border, which is now, of course, closed.
200 days till Brexit, and for the Prime Minister, it's not just time that's slipping away. The number of MPs willing to back her plan is also ticking down, with a warning today that 80 of her own could now vote against her, according to the maths of one former minister.
More than 1 million Americans have been told to flee to safety as the most powerful hurricane in 3 decades approaches the East Coast. Hurricane Florence is currently 1,000 miles away in the Atlantic. It's set to barrel into North and South Carolina on Friday and then to sit over the area all weekend. Robert Moore reports on the evacuations and the preparations.
Today's forensic results from Egypt's chief prosecutor say John Cooper suffered acute intestinal dysentery caused by E. coli and that his wife Susan had contracted a blood disorder that can lead to kidney failure, also likely to be due to E. coli. The results also conclude that Mr. Cooper had...
And he's not alone. The report today found 1 in 3 victims are unsatisfied with how police responded to their crimes. Last year, the arrest rate fell from 17 to 14 arrests per 1,000 people. Perhaps it's not surprising because, on average, forces have reduced their staff numbers by almost a fifth since 2010.
And the picture of policing elsewhere in the UK is also one of cuts and stretched resources. In Scotland, there are currently just over 17,000 full-time officers, but that is the lowest level since 2009. Overall, the number of recorded crimes in Scotland last year was 244,000, a 1.7% increase from the year before. And in Northern Ireland, police officer numbers are currently around 6,600, a fall of 10% since 2010. And the number of recorded crimes in Northern Ireland is also on the rise at 98,300 last year, a small 0.4% increase on the year before.
Their plan is to use technology to avoid a hard border, with trusted traders allowed to cross without being stopped and customs brokers helping companies fill out any forms online.
Do you think there's any chance?
But time is tight to get that clarity. EU leaders meet in Salzburg next week and will agree another special summit on Brexit for November. That will be make or break. By then, the view is time really will have run out, because a deal must be ratified both at Westminster and the European Parliament to be ready for the 29th of March next year, Brexit Day.
The government wants all new cars and vans to be effectively zero emission by 2040. That's ambitious. Of the 2.5 million cars sold in the UK last year, only 13,500 were pure battery power electric vehicles.
А сейчас без комментариев можно? Еще пока. Комментарии я пока не даю. На следующей неделе, я думаю.
Мы знаем, кто они такие уже, мы их нашли. Ну, надеюсь, что они сами появятся и сами себе расскажут. Это будет лучше для всех. Ну, ничего там особенного и криминального нет, уверяю вас. Ну, посмотрим в ближайшее время.
Они гражданские?
Не слышу.
Гражданские?
Гражданские, конечно. Ну, конечно.
Today's forensic results from Egypt's chief prosecutor say John Cooper suffered acute intestinal dysentery caused by E. coli, and that his wife Susan had contracted a blood disorder that can lead to kidney failure, also likely to be due to E. coli. The results also conclude that Mr. Cooper had pre-existing heart disease.
The brainchild of former Tory leader Ian Duncan Smith, Universal Credit is aimed at bringing together a number of different benefits, including housing benefit, job seekers allowance and tax credits into one monthly payment. The system should have been fully in place by last year, but delays mean that less than 15% of the 8 million people who should qualify are currently actually getting the benefit, and it's not expected to be fully rolled out for another 5 years. Universal Credit also set off some pretty heated exchanges at Prime Minister's questions today.
The National Audit Office report earlier this year found many claimants had struggled to adjust, with 40% saying they experienced financial difficulties, while problems with the rollout meant 20% weren't paid in full and on time, and a predicted £8 billion boost to the Exchequer was based on unproven assumptions.
Now, the trouble with weather of any kind is its unpredictability, of course, and that's what makes a monster like Hurricane Florence all the more dangerous. We already know of the threat from this huge storm with its 130-mile-an-hour winds as it approaches America's eastern seaboard. But now it seems to be actually changing behaviour with potentially even deadlier effect. Florence is now forecast to stall just off North Carolina's coast on Friday morning. Latest predictions say it will then track left, smashing into the Myrtle Beach resort of South Carolina, home to 500,000 residents. From there, the hurricane will sweep towards Georgia, which today became the latest place to declare a state of emergency. One official said the communities in its path are facing a Mike Tyson punch.
The suspects claim they were in Salisbury to visit the historic cathedral and that it was a stop on the way to see the archaeological site at Old Sarum. But CCTV captured the two men on Wilton Road, a footpath away from the Skripal's house, where the attack took place.
And a series of technical papers issued by the government highlighted that exiting the UK without agreement could hoist on us a series of irksome costs and chores. There could be an end to free roaming on mobile phones in Europe, but the government would cap data charges at £45 a month. We may have to buy an international driving permit to drive in Europe. And there's a warning to renew passports that are only 6 months or less from their expiry date, because otherwise we may not be let into the European Union.
Hello and welcome back. Criminal gangs in Vietnam are turning the country into a new hub for the trade in illegal elephant ivory. Secret filming given to ITV News reveals how trafficking syndicates are using corrupt police officers, soldiers and customs officials. The Environmental Investigation Agency estimates that since 2009, 76 tonnes of ivory related to the Vietnam trade have been seized. The tusks of as many as 11,414 dead elephants. Our Asia correspondent Debbie Edward now reports on the illegal trade.
Đi thì ở đây thì dễ nói thật luôn là cái người trong nước này nó cái thèm tiền. Em đi kiểu gì cũng đi được. Đi từ đây đi nó đéo vào trước em. Nó mà chạy đều thì rất nhiều tiền, mẹ hơn buôn ma túy luôn.
Massive efforts have been made in recent years to stop the illegal international trade in ivory. But despite some success in blocking traditional smuggling routes into countries like China, where demand remains high, ITV News has learnt that thousands of elephants are still being slaughtered for their tusks. Gangs based in Vietnam are now opening up new routes for the illicit plunder, such as from Mozambique to Malaysia, through Laos to Vietnam, and from there to China. It's estimated that 76 tonnes of ivory related to the Vietnam trade have been seized since 2009. This represents nearly 11,500 elephants killed. We've been given access to some secret filming of how this disturbing new trend is helping keep this distressing trade in business. Maternity and paternity leave. Her mum, the Lib Dem Jo Swinson, later tweeted another bit of progress in Parliament today and thanked her colleagues for their support.
And it's valued under £20 million. Let's put that in context, though. The total value of the Church of England's investment fund stands at a huge £8.3 billion. Through the church commissioners, they invest in cash and property, and they also hold shares in companies from Google to oil giants like BP and pharmaceutical firm GlaxoSmithKline. And last year, it made a profit of 7% on its holdings. Now, the church said today that they've previously been on the record that they consider aggressive tax avoidance or abusive tax arrangements to be a business risk, and they take the view it's more effective to be in the room with these companies as an
Across England and Wales, prison officers have had enough. From Durham to Liverpool and Manchester in the north to Swansea in the west, thousands walked out this morning, protesting unprecedented levels of violence and fearing for their future safety. As well as Bedford, Nottingham, Exeter and Birmingham prisons have all been given official urgent notifications warning of dire conditions within the last 12 months. And the Chief Inspector's annual report warns how thousands of inmates across England and Wales are living in squalid and overcrowded cells, locked up for nearly 24 hours a day and with record numbers of assaults and self-harm.
Today, a lawyer representing his widow, Michelle, told the inquest the evidence will show that for at least 46 minutes, there is no evidence of authorised firearms officers being present or in close proximity to the gates in the CCTV footage. A can of CS spray and a baton against a large man armed with 2 knives. It's not an equal fight.
Urgent notifications have now been issued to Bedford, Nottingham, Exeter and Birmingham prisons. And there are problems across many of the 118 prisons and remand units in England and Wales. 83,000 prisoners and the staff in charge of them are facing issues with overcrowding, the increased availability of drugs and an increase in serious violence, which has risen every year since 2013.
Welcome back. ITV News has learned new driver training sessions are to be offered to users of mobility scooters after a jump in the number of accidents. There's been a boom in the number of people using them, but there's no training or test required. There are now an estimated 350,000 mobility scooter users in Britain. In 2016, they were involved in 260 accidents, up 17% on the year before, and 14 users were killed. 3 people have died in Derby, from where our consumer editor Chris Choi has this report.
Good evening. They've been bracing themselves for days, but torrential rain, high winds and raging floodwaters began to do their worst along the eastern coastline of the US today as Florence finally hit. Well, 4 people are already known to have been killed as the huge storm now begins to move slowly inland, threatening widespread and catastrophic damage. Well, the eye of the storm first hit land this morning, bringing flash floods across North Carolina. Thousands of homes there are without power. In the next few hours, it'll cross into neighbouring South Carolina, where more torrential rain is forecast, adding to the storm's surges created by the high winds. Then, over the weekend, Florence will head inland, passing through communities like Columbia and Greenville, where hundreds of thousands of people live in its path. It has been extreme not just in the Atlantic. 7 active systems are now raging around the globe. Forecasters believe a record-breaking 8th could be on the way. Along with Florence, Tropical Storm Isaac is hovering over the Caribbean, where warnings are in place for Martinique, Guadeloupe and Dominica. Joyce, another storm to the east, is predicted to reach winds of up to 70 miles per hour. The tail of Hurricane Helene is expected to bring wet and windy weather to Britain early next week as it rolls through the North Atlantic. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, former Hurricane Olivia has just moved clear of Hawaii, while Vietnam and Laos will be hit by heavy rains and strong winds from Storm Barajat. But the strongest of them all is Super Typhoon Mangkhut, equivalent to a Category 5 hurricane. Mangkhut is beginning to make its impact felt in the northern Philippines tonight.
She says, I can't see them coming back with a deal that is going to meet our 6 tests. And even if they come back in October, November, and they say this flimsy bit of paper is what you're going to have to agree to, otherwise there'll be no deal, we're not going to agree to either of those. Well, why is that a problem for the Prime Minister? Well, the fact is, she says, I can't see them coming back with a deal that is going to meet our 6 tests. And even if they come back in October, November, and they say this flimsy bit of paper is what you're going to have to agree to, otherwise there'll be no deal, we're not going to agree to either of those. Well, why is that a problem for the Prime Minister? Well, the fact is,